If you are gluten intolerant or you're on a low-carb diet, I am sorry. The next 6 weeks are Jesus saying, I am the bread of life. I will be preaching actually mostly from Exodus. That's our first lesson, Exodus chapter 16. When I was a kid, my mom used to say to me, complaining gets you nowhere. But, this is the trick, right? But I was in church frequently because my mother was a pastor. And I heard this Exodus lesson in church one Sunday, and my mom said to me later that day when I was complaining about what she was making for dinner, she said, complaining will get you nowhere. And I said, but the Israelites complained, and God gave them exactly what they wanted. My mom's response was, yeah, but they got the same meal every day for 40 years. So if you get nothing else from this sermon, please get this. God will answer our every complaint in the wilderness and will also change us. We meet the people of Israel after they have been freed from captivity in Exodus chapter 16. If you've got the movie The 10 Commandments in your head, well, this is the part after the Red Sea has been parted and then filled in on the Egyptians, and after Charlton Heston has had that wonderful moment on the seashore. They find themselves in the wilderness, and the wilderness is not a comfortable place to be in. It is a place of death, usually. There's not much there. The Israelites also find themselves in a situation they have never been before. They are free. The Bible tells us that for 400 years, the people of Israel were in captivity in Egypt. And so for 400 years, they have not been free, and suddenly they find themselves very free indeed. So there's two things that they are experiencing right now. They're experiencing anxiety. Situation they've never been before. And they're experiencing fear because they're in a place that is not comfortable and does not easily provide for them. So that's when we meet the group of people that all pastors call the Back to Egypt Committee. They come to Moses and Aaron, and they have this great line. It's so over the top. If only we had died in Egypt. Drama much, right? But then they say the real issue, right? They say, if only we had died in Egypt when we sat by the flesh pots and ate our fill of bread. For you have brought us out into the wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. If only we could go back to Egypt where we ate our fill of bread. The truth about what they're saying is this, is that Egypt had its advantages. Yeah, they were enslaved, but there were 3 meals a day. It's important. Egypt involved slavery, it involved oppression, but there was food. And the food was secure and easy to get and plentiful. The Bible tells us that the main work the Israelites did actually was building vast store cities because there was so much stuff and so much food that the Egyptians had, that they needed to build whole cities devoted to it, to storing it up. It came at the price of freedom. It came at the price of liberty. It came at the price of them being the free people of God, but there were 3 meals a day. The reason we can read the Old Testament and still find something in it is because people really haven't changed all that much. Kind of like the Israelites, we are pretty sure that God will not answer prayers out in the wilderness. And kind of like the Israelites in this moment, because we're pretty sure God doesn't answer prayers out in the wilderness, we are perfectly willing to go back to Egypt, whatever your Egypt is. We are perfectly willing to go back to that behavior that hurts others. We are perfectly willing to continue again and again to return to that substance that we think gives us the ability to continue on. We are perfectly willing to go back to Egypt in all its various forms in our life. The beautiful thing about the story is that the Back to Egypt committee doesn't actually get its way. And not only do they not get their way, but God answers every prayer. My mom may have said complaining gets you nowhere, but this isn't actually true in this case, right? God answers every prayer. So God says, okay, I've heard you, and so in the morning you are about to get all the food you'll ever need. And they go out and they find this fine, flaky substance. I love this. The people go, what is it? Which is all manna actually literally means, right? Manna literally translated means, what is it? Moses said, it is the bread the Lord has provided for you. It's an amazing story that their complaints are answered, and that the hungry are satisfied, and that the cries of the protesters are heard, and that the anxious find relief for their troubled minds, and that the fearful find they have no reason to be afraid. That God simply answers all these prayers. Better yet, God doesn't answer them because they're particularly good. Every piece of the wilderness story is a piece of failure on the behalf of the people. And yet, God continually answers their prayers out in the wilderness and continually feeds them. Jesus puts it this way in our gospel lesson. Jesus says that this is the work of God, that you believe in him who sent. Jesus is a good Lutheran. You may think I'm kidding, but I'm not. That God answers our prayers and God gives us grace, and we find new life and resurrection in the cross of Jesus Christ, not because we've qualified for it and not because we've succeeded at passing the test. Believe me, the Israelites haven't, and neither have we, but simply because this is what God does. God freely feeds us, provides for us, gives us grace, raises us to new life, raises us from the dead out in the wilderness. The trick, though, is that's only half the miracle. The bread from heaven is a wonderful miracle, although I'm sure they wished for a menu change at about year 29. But, that's a wonderful part of the miracle, but it's only half the story, because the other half of the story is how, in providing for them, in feeding them, in answering their prayers out in the wilderness, God also changes these people. It takes 40 years, but in those 40 years, the people of Israel, by being fed by God out in the wilderness, will go from the people who think it's a good idea to go back to slavery in Egypt to the people who trust that God provides enough, even in the wilderness. Even in this place of death and destruction and uncertainty, God provides enough, and they will become the people who trust that. They will become the people of God who trust that God's risky freedom out in the wilderness involves new life, and that is better than all the comfortable security and slavery of Egypt. In a few moments, you will also be fed. You'll be fed by some bread, the bread of life. Although I think we have a better idea of what it is than the manna that the Israelites had. And as you are being fed by the bread of heaven, the question is this: how is God changing you? The feeding is only half the miracle. The other half is how God changes you and turns you into a new person, into a new people, turns all of us into this new people of God in the world. How is God changing you? Perhaps God is changing you in that he's giving you an opportunity and teaching you to speak the truth in love, as Ephesians says. There's been a lot of truth-telling this week, and I say truth-telling in quotes. And what we really mean often when we say truth-telling is we say something as offensively as possible. There's been a lot of truth-telling, but none of it has been particularly loving. And so perhaps God is teaching us and changing us into a people who tell the truth in love. Or perhaps you keep encountering that culture you don't like or that lifestyle you disapprove of, not because the world is falling apart, but because God is putting you on a long, maybe 40-year journey of seeing people different than you in a loving way. Or perhaps, as Ephesians says, perhaps God is working patience in you, patience that bears one another up in love. My sister tells a great story about how once when she was 10 years old, she prayed for patience, and since then God has been giving her nothing but people to be patient with. She then says, watch out what you pray for. But perhaps God is working that in you. Perhaps God is changing you into that person who, with patience, bears one another in love. And one another means everybody, not just the people you like. In a few moments, you will be fed with the bread from heaven. And we will hear that God does answer complaining people. A certain way, my mom was wrong. I don't often say that. Complaining did kind of get the Israelites somewhere, but it got them somewhere because God hears and answers our prayers. And because God works a change in us too. Amen.